A warm welcome to everyone at Ultimate Meaning, the Theory of Samsara. Today it is my great pleasure to introduce you all to Eugene the Philosopher. Eugene has a channel on YouTube where he discusses just about everything you could imagine, from population decline, artificial intelligence, social media, etc. I'd recommend you to visit his channel sometime. He's got a lot to say on many different topics. Hello, Eugene.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Dharma, Yoga.
Yeah. So I thought it would be quite nice to talk to Eugene today because he's somebody who's, well, he's kind of technically, I suppose, an academic or an intellectual in Belarus. And he studied physics, that's one thing, but he also has a sort of deep interest in Western philosophy. And these are things that many of us aren't really kind of party to, this kind of knowledge or education in Western science, etc. But there are certain links between religion, philosophy, and science, and I thought we would explore these today. So first, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, Eugene?
Okay, so I am 35 years old. I am a trained physicist, so literally like my bachelor's degree is in theoretical physics. I also have a master's in theoretical physics, but I didn't have a PhD. I've written my thesis, but I haven't defended it. Like, not completely written, let's put it this way. It's like 70% complete. But since then, I'm actually glad I haven't defended it because the theory I've been writing it on is incorrect in my current opinion. Okay, yeah. So the topic was about the strong interaction physics. So that would be like quarks and gluons, what happens within the atomic nucleus, things like that.
Okay, yeah. You have to be careful because you'll lose us if you start talking about quarks and gluons.
I mean, I think I can talk about this in a way that we won't lose anyone, hopefully at least.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, so this is like a formal education, right? But I've also been interested in philosophy, as you've noted, since I've been like 16 years old, about so. And I mean,
I saw your video where you compared all the different philosophers,
yes.
sort of in a chart. And then you put niche over here somewhere, like completely separate. I thought that was quite funny.
Yeah, I've been a big fan of Nietzsche. Yeah, that's true. And I mean,
but I mean, what the hell is Nietzsche actually talking about? That's the question.
It's a difficult one, by the way, because his philosophy is not very structured. Like, he was writing in aphorisms, like very short, chunks of text. And he keeps also like jumping from one topic to the other, and like he talks about like, again, art, science, and philosophy, and all kinds of stuff like this, like social processes, religion.
Yeah. So hence the influence on your own channel then, I guess.
Yeah.
You do a very similar sort of thing.
Definitely.
Now, you mentioned to me something about a quote from Descartes before, and that was that the roots of the tree of knowledge are metaphysics, its trunk is physics, and its branches are various applied things like ethics, medicine, etc., etc. That's very interesting, because I've always wondered about the interrelationship between religion, philosophy, science, etc. There are these sort of kind of boundaries where they meet, these horizons where all these disciplines meet. And I saw on your channel that you kind of described what philosophy was all about. I think many people wonder this. So could you kind of just explain to us in your own kind of words and your own opinion what philosophy is all about, this discipline of philosophy?
Okay. Well, first of all, it's this quote from Descartes. It comes from Descartes, right? It doesn't necessarily reflect my own opinion, all right?
Yeah.
It's the opinion of early European philosophers of modernity. So that would be like the middle of the 17th century, something like this. So then people really thought that, like basically this big division between matter and spirit happened during the modernity, like again, the middle of the 17th century. So then people thought that, yes, you can basically explain more or less everything in physicalist terms, in terms of physics. So that's why he says that the tree of knowledge is physics, the trunk, or roots, or whatever was roots probably.
The roots are metaphysics, the trunk is physics.
Okay. So then in philosophy, like things like clockwork metaphor appears. Thomas Hobbes, the British philosopher, he says that mostly famous for his societal works, by the way, the Leviathan, where he compares the government to this big monster, Leviathan. But he's also the author of this clockwork metaphor of the world, where basically, the world consists of small details, like, again, atoms or whatever, working on very simple laws, and the accumulation of these simple interactions leads to all the multiplicity that we observe. This is like the clockwork metaphor, that everything is deterministic, blah, blah, blah. But regarding philosophy in general, if you ask for my opinion, like in my video, I specifically talk about how philosophy is well, you may formulate it like it's an art of making obvious things not obvious, something like this. Like, like a regular person would look at an apple and say, okay, this is an apple. But a philosopher would say, like, well, what is an apple? What does it mean to look? Like, what is color? So,
and the everyday Joe will say, why are you causing trouble? Why don't you just talk straight?
Yeah. So basically, an obvious thing, or obvious in air quotes, like an apple, it becomes a problem suddenly, and this is where you start doing philosophy, in my opinion.
So are you saying that philosophers' whole object in life is to cause trouble? Is that what you're saying?
In some way, yes. So, yeah. This is actually one of the things which captivates me about it, because I still have this sort of troublemaking.
Why? Because you're a troublemaker.
Nature, but you have to do it in style. Walking around and causing trouble on the streets is not cool enough. But if you can cause, if you can cause, like centuries worth of trouble for many thinkers, that's a much better way of doing things. And I sincerely
you philosophers,
think,
you just give everybody a headache,
I sincerely think that the greatest philosophers were at least partly motivated by something like this, They were always pissed off by at their reality, at least to some degree. And they kind of wanted revenge, I almost feel like, They were saying, like,
and did they ever come up with any solutions ever? Has philosophy come up with solutions or improved our life in any way?
Well, a lot of philosophical ideas have definitely crystallized into some, let's say, again, scientific concepts or even artistic concepts. So obviously, ideas don't exist in a vacuum. Once they are being heard and perceived by people and shared, then it becomes the part of, I don't know, collective unconscious or whatever you want to call it. The culture, I guess, would be a better word. And then they can influence stuff for sure.
Yeah. I think we often don't recognize how much we are influenced by philosophers. Many people have this kind of idea that, well, I don't really need to study Aristotle. I don't need to study Kant because they're kind of like too intellectual and all outdated. I can just make my own kind of world philosophy and that'll be fine. And I think this point that Vlad Vexler had made previously is really, 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 really precise, because what we do is we've heard all little bits about Aristotle. We've heard little bits about Kant. So when we cobble together our own philosophy, all we're doing is making like a second-rate Aristotle or a second-rate or oversimplified kind of philosophy that we've picked up at some point, we've been exposed to. Is there any territory where philosophy and, let's say, for instance, physics meet? Is there any common ground between these?
I would say so. There's actually a lot of common ground, and again, relating to my own personal experience, like, believe it or not, but I went to study physics specifically because I thought it would make me a better philosopher. Like, this was basically the most important reason for me to study physics. And I believe it helped me a lot. So I've kind of reached my goal in this respect. But kind of returning to what you've said previously, actually, scientists are one of the people who are actually influenced by philosophy the most, but who are also the most ignorant about it. Because every kind of scientific paradigm, if you think about it, is heavily philosophical in its, again, roots, or metaphysical, you might say, but this is also basically philosophy. And but scientists just kind of, like, I don't know what would be a good metaphor for this, but they just don't notice it somehow.
Right. They're kind of
like
ignorant of their own acceptance of philosophy.
no, like they're ignorant not even of the acceptance. It's rather they're accepting certain philosophy without realizing it. And actually, modern science is built, if you think about it factually, they would probably not acknowledge this, the scientists themselves, because they are ignorant again about this fact. But it's built on a philosophy of positivism. It's like a specific instance of Western philosophy which appeared at the very beginning of 19th century. Was produced by Auguste Comte, the French philosopher, and just French thinker, you might say. And like, kind of like, how would you say it? Like, again, almost subconsciously, most of the scientists, at least physicists, follow this philosophy. Even though, again, they might not even know it. Okay, yeah, sure. So positivism says that there are things in the world which we can observe. This is kind of like almost an axiom. And we may also observe, let's say, connections between those things. So, for example, if I click a button, something happens. If I click a button again, something happens again. This sort of correlations, aka causations, almost. And
is that related to predictable outcomes as well?
Yes, exactly. So positivism says that it is exactly those things which we should study, the connections between various observables, let's put it this way. We shouldn't, positivism says, we shouldn't be concerned with fundamental reality behind them, whatever it is. Like, we should only be concerned with what we can observe and measure, and like connections between those things which we can observe and measure. And that's it. So basically, for example, you've mentioned Kant, like this idea of Dinge an sich in German, which means like things on their own, in their own sort of like heavenly domain, somewhere out there, you know, like positivists say we should just ignore this. Or, you know, the world of ideas of Plato, like there are, again, this sort of perfect world where ideas live, and there is imperfect world where we live. So again, positivists just completely like cut ties to any things like that. We just need to study connections between things we can observe and measure. This is the philosophy of positivism in a nutshell.
Yeah. So then that brings us to the next category, which is metaphysics. And I think most people get the wrong idea about what metaphysics is. They think it's got something to do with like sort of witchcraft and fairies and that sort of stuff. But could you kind of give us an idea of what this kind of domain of metaphysics is all about?
All right, I will try. Well, the term metaphysics comes actually from Aristotle, not from Aristotle himself, but from people who have collected his works. All right. So he had a bunch of works which were generally united by the title of physics. These works were talking about nature, again, in sort of like a positivistic sense, you might say. So this was one pile of books called physics, you know, and there was another pile of books after them which people don't know how to classify, so they call them metaphysics, which means literally something that comes after physics, you know. There's a pile of books called physics, there's a pile of books which comes after the pile of books which is called physics. So does
that mean everything that lies outside of what can be physically kind of observed or measured?
Yeah, like, well, I told you the etymology, but factually what people usually understand by the term metaphysics is something not directly observable. That would probably be the best way to put it. So some reality which stands behind the observable reality. So this would be, again, much closer to Plato's world of ideas or Kant's things on their own. So metaphysics,
it's kind of the opposite of what people in positivism are looking at.
Yes. So,
the fundamental truth of reality.
Yeah, so you may reformulate what I've said about positivists as positivists are people who deny metaphysics or something like that, or who ignore metaphysics. And metaphysics deals with exactly that it's something beyond the observable reality.
So I suppose this then brings us to this final category, which is kind of religion. And in many ways, I think religion tries to give answers to this question of the ultimate reality. What is your take on this discipline of religion, or doctrinal belief?
Well, I mean, it's a big thing, religion. It has a lot of things in it. So, can you maybe clarify your question a little bit? Like,
well, I mean,
in which respect?
Is there a difference between religion and philosophy? Is there a difference between religion and metaphysics? Is it kind of, part of a kind of Venn diagram between these different disciplines, or is it something unique? What makes religion unique or different?
That's a very difficult question, I gotta say. Like, what is the difference between religion and philosophy? Well, I can tell you what is the similarity between them, that's for sure. That would be easier. These are both worldviews, basically. These are forms of the worldview. By the way, science is not a worldview. I also have a video which is exactly titled that.
Okay.
So, religion is much closer to philosophy than it is to science, I would say, because it also is a worldview. What is the difference between them? It's very subtle. Like, I would say religion is much more ethically oriented, so it has a much heavier ethical component, whereas philosophy is, it can contain, and actually it does contain ethical component, but in philosophy it's usually very personal. Like, it's not like, not very applicable to the whole society, I might claim. Something like this. But again, the difference is very hard to distinguish.
And one definition that I read specifies that religion is kind of more related to the belief in a creator God, or ultimate authority of God that is given to us through doctrine. So is it necessary within a religion to have some like God-like figure at the heart or the core of that belief system?
Well, again, all right. So let me try to figure this out from what I just said. So if religion requires, as I've said, even though I'm not sure that what I've said is true, but let's assume it is true. So if it requires a heavy ethical component, so it basically tells you what you ought to do, what you should do, then there must be some sort of source for this statement, like
authority.
Yes, there must be some authority. So I would say that by necessity, religion has to have something like this.
It has to be dogmatic or doctrinal.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. So now from what you've said, we've kind of identified a bit of a sticking point. It's something that I think you yourself will have some experience in. And you talked about kind of science in terms of positivism, where we look at causal and resultant links. And we look for things, for example, that produce kind of predictable outcomes. And then, as you know, recently, with the advent of quantum physics, then we've kind of created an internal problem here. Because now, because of this uncertainty principle, what we're displaying is that we can't really ultimately make these predictions. So could you explain a little bit about the importance of this uncertainty principle and how that causes dissonance with the traditional positivist view?
Well, from the point
not
of
everyone will understand what this is, right? Not everyone will know what this uncertainty principle is all about, so you might need to explain a little bit.
All right, that's not a problem, actually. So the uncertainty principle, to put it very simply, all right, it says that, I'm making it slightly wrong, actually, but for the sake of simplicity, okay? So you cannot measure two quantities simultaneously with infinite precision. So basically, there are certain pairs of these quantities, for example, energy and time, or position and momentum, aka velocity. So position and speed of a particle, or its energy and time that it exists for or in. So if you measured the position of a particle infinitely precisely, like you know exactly where it is, then you have no idea about its velocity, like where it's going and how fast. Or vice versa, if you know where it's going and how fast, you have no idea where it is, okay? And the same goes for energy and time, like, for example, but, okay, let's not think about energy and time, it would be much more difficult to explain. But with position and velocity, at least, I think it's fairly clear what I've said. So I can tell you the answer you would probably get from a positivist to your statement that it is problematic somehow. They would say it's not problematic because, again, we have the uncertainty principle, which allows us to quantify the error we may get. So they'll just say, okay, it's a fundamental reality that quantum particles behave in this way. Like, they just do, and that's what we observe, and we can quantify our uncertainty, and it's all fine because of this, you know? Like, they would probably not go as far as to say that, you know, something is fundamentally broken in our philosophical foundations of our science. I think that would be their answer. But some of the, you know, like philosophers of science and scientists, when they think about philosophy, they're actually saying, like, wait a minute, maybe our, you know, naive determinism is broken by this uncertainty, because it kind of is. Like, if we cannot measure precisely certain quantities, because, you know, like, ever since the beginning of 19th century, again, when positivism was beginning, there was a big optimism towards determinism, and I have to apologize for so many isms here. So what determinism means is that if we know the initial state of a system, like, I know the positions of every particle and their velocities, I can calculate with basically infinite precision any future position, right? So everything is predetermined, essentially. But if we don't know even the positions and velocities, at the very least, of at least some particles, let alone all the particles, then this picture is kind of broken, and it kind of is broken. So
yeah, as I understand it, at the time of Newton, and they kind of figured that they kind of got everything into place and they could calculate everything in it. But this idea that everything is predetermined is difficult, I think. It's often what is taught in religion. But if things are predetermined, then that suggests there is no such thing as free will, right? Is that right, or is that not right?
Yeah, I would say so, but I would say that it is not quite fair to attribute these views to Newton and people of his generation, because, again, Newton was working at the late 17th century, early 18th. Like, it wasn't very science-centric back then. Like, again, Newton was a big devout he was a religious guy, you know. Right. Like, he himself believed in God, and etc., etc. So this is like turbo optimism regarding, you know, everything is deterministic. It's really a thing of 19th century more than previous times. Yeah.
As I understand it, many people at that time of Newton, then they believed that God was like the great architect. They kind of like set the wheels in motion and then allowed the universe to unfold. So,
yeah, that's certainly true, but I just don't think that scientists back then, at the time of Newton, had this hubris, you know, that we can explain everything. Like, again, they would probably be atheists then if they did believe so.
Yeah. So what's your position on free will? Many people debate this point.
Well, I mean, my position is kind of difficult to explain. Like, I'm much actually closer, I think, from what I've heard you saying, I'm much closer to Buddhist gnoseology, I mean, than to, I don't know, like naive objectivism, if you know what I mean. Like, I don't really think that objects such as quantum particles or whatever other types of particles, they exist in some fundamental reality. I actually think that we construct these objects as means to describe the world to ourselves and to each other in our communication. So we use objects such as, again, particles just as ways of communication, essentially.
Like a way of explaining or describing reality.
Yeah. I have a video called Nature of Knowledge where I talk in quite a bit of detail about this, how I think knowledge is just a bunch of stories that people tell each other about the world. And every story, you know, it has to be told in certain language. It contains certain characters. Like, you can say, okay, there is Zeus. he throws thunderbolts, or you can say, okay, there's electron, it moves in a conductor. So it's the same story told with different, characters and doing slightly different things, but it's a story essentially, both of these. So believing in electron.
This is quite a common position in the Hindu circles. Many people describe the way that we experience reality as just being a narrative. That's quite common. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, that's essentially my view. So, determinism is even a much later addition to this, right? Firstly, we have to agree that there are particles, fundamental reality containing particles. I already disagree here, Then you have to agree that there are certain fundamental laws which these particles operate under or with. And only then you can say, well, then everything is determined, all right?
Yeah, right.
So I'm already lost, somewhere at the first step.
Yeah, interesting, because this debate came up in early Buddhism as well. I mean, the earlier schools are called the atomists, and they did believe in these substantial particles. But all the later schools of Buddhism say that it's wrong to assume that there is some fixed kind of particle that has substantial reality. So it's interesting to see that debate has resonated through this, millennia.
And I can tell you about, I've been very interested in sociology of science, again, which basically is, it sounds a little bit stupid, what do you mean sociology of science? But really, modern philosophy of science only exists in the form of sociology of science. So it kind of started, this big shift started in something like 1970s, where real philosophy of science kind of died, because again, scientists think they don't need philosophy, and philosophers don't know science enough to say anything about it, So a big shift appeared, but there were still sociologists who studied how scientists work in their lab and what they're actually doing, And so philosophy of science became sociology of science in a way.
Okay.
And the most modern, I would say, I mean, it's already slightly outdated, but the last big thing in philosophy of science was so-called action network theory, or ANT. Action network theory, yeah. So what it said was essentially that, we construct objects, so it also kind of starts with this point, but it actually considers every object, including every scientific object, such as an electron, for example, as a node of a big network, like a graph, So in order for a scientific object to be constructed solidly, it needs big networks of support. Basically a lot of other things must need this object to exist, Then we can come to some sort of almost like a political agreement. Various groups of interest may agree that this object is useful and start using it, and then it becomes kind of stronger, For example, what kind of networks can we talk about? One experiment, for example, which is operated by a very successful laboratory, that would be another node, supported by some big scientists, supported by big funding. So this experiment is very important, but it kind of, supports the existence of our object, for example, right? Then, for example, if you start with a concept, let's just use electron as an example. If you have electrons, then you perhaps may build something out of it, and perhaps some industry may be interested in it, etc., etc. So these big networks might be built, and then this object kind of solidifies, and then so
these objects depend on the networks, basically.
Yes.
They don't exist without these networks.
That's
interesting, because that really is quite close to this Hindu concept of Indra's net, and also interdependence in Buddhism, that describes that reality is like this web, and on it there are nodes, and these nodes are signified by little jewels or dewdrops on each node, and it says that all reality is made up of these nets of interdependent networks.
And it's very clear, in economy. For example, there was a very famous short essay called "I comma pencil, like I pencil, where the guy, like, it was written in defense of a free market. Basically, the main idea was to explain how a single pencil is made and like how big of a network is required. Like how many people are involved, like, you know, in order to make it, you need like graphite, like somebody needs to get carbon, somebody needs to press it, somebody needs to deliver it, somebody needs to build machines that do all of this, somebody needs to mine fuel for these machines, somebody needs to burn it, like somebody needs to generate electricity, somebody needs to cut wood, somebody needs to saw it, etc., etc. Like there's literally millions of people working on a single pencil, right, who've never met each other actually. And kind of the same thing happens in science, like, but we don't really acknowledge it all that often, at least. But I actually have a video, like, it's very simplified, but I'm trying to sort of like analyze the networks of a double slit experiment that is done in quantum mechanics, just to demonstrate how complex these networks really are and how underappreciated they are. Because in a double slit experiment, there is even a, like, internal logical contradiction. Like, I'm not gonna, like, I'll spare you the details, all right? It's just like we shoot some particles through two holes, essentially, in a certain barrier. And then we see one picture, and when we close one hole, we see another, and blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really matter for the sake of this discussion. But, like, for example, there is an internal contradiction in a way that is formulated where we say we have an impenetrable barrier, okay? So this is one of the prerequisites of the experiment in the first place. But quantum mechanics, which this experiment is about, is also saying that there are no such thing as an impenetrable barrier in the first place. So, you know, like, it is internally contradictory, the way you build it, but, you know, it's kind of ignored for the most part.
It's like we ask the questions in the context of classical physics about quantum physics. I think that's what we often
something
do.
Like that. Yeah.
I think this is the issue about waveform collapse, like, for example, the Copenhagen model, etc. So we're looking for a system to explain something that we're kind of like presuming is based on classical interpretations. So I'd like you to just talk a little bit about this, because we hear about this a lot in quantum physics, etc. We're lay people, right? We haven't studied science, and we hear about superposition and waveform collapse. And then it sounds complicated, but like there's a few questions like, why do we need waveform collapse? How do we know that there is collapse, etc.? And what are these basic solutions that people came up with? And are these solutions just ideas, or are they something that they've actually, you know, have basis in reality?
Well, I mean, it all stems from one big problem with quantum mechanics, is that people have come up with a mathematical apparatus, like a mathematical formalism, which seems to describe experiments really well, but the ontological, if you wish, or like, I mean, philosophical part is lacking. Like, basically, we have a mathematical equation which describes a certain object, but we have no idea what kind of object it is, right? So this is the fundamental problem of quantum mechanics. It's exactly the lack of understanding of what we're talking about. Like, we seem to be able to describe experiments, but we don't. We're losing the fundamental ontology. I don't have any other way of describing it. Like, ontology is
what it actually is.
Yes, right? Yes. Ontology asks the question, what is, you know, like what's the thing we're talking about even, all right? So the wave function collapse, it follows from this problem as well. Like, in the formalism of quantum mechanics, you have, for example, like, if you have a particle that can be in two possible states, like, for example, well, I'm thinking of a better analogy. Maybe we shouldn't talk about particles. Like, let's talk about, like, a frequently used example is socks. Okay, like, let's say you've picked up a sock from a washing machine, and you still haven't figured if it's a left sock or a right sock. Okay, it could be either of these. So if it was a quantum sock, it could have been not just either left or right. It could have been in a third state, which is both left and right simultaneously. That's, you know, the famous...
Is that possible?
Schrodinger's cat problem,
Right,
right?
okay.
Like it's not just the cat can be alive or dead. It can also be in a third state, which is alive dead. It's
Like a zombie cat.
Yeah. So the existence of this third state is absolutely necessary for quantum mathematical formalism, quantum mechanical formalism. But
Okay.
it's like
So we believe that there's these things that are a left and a right sock at the same time.
Yes. In quantum mechanics, you have
And
to
that's not
have
just
them.
something they've made up, right? That's something
You have
that's
to
a real
have them.
certainty of.
You have to have them, absolutely. And the problem is that obviously when you measure, like when you look at this sock, closely, you find that it's either left or right? So and this third possibility just completely vanishes somewhere, like it's never been there. And so it's not just a problem of statistics, it's a problem of some sort of fundamental reality, if you wish. And the collapse of wave function or, there are many synonyms for this procedure, but it's basically that. It's the disappearance of these, and this third state, by the way, is what we call superposition state. So this is like,
when
left,
it's both
right.
two things at the same time.
Yes. Yeah. So the vanishing of these superpositions during the measurement, and also like the vanishing of the other...
So this happens when you actually look at it, right? This
Yes.
happens once you measure it. Before
Yes.
you measure it, you don't know. But when you look
Yes.
at it, then you... Okay.
But there is also a small misconception here, is that like some people call it, the observer effect, etc. But it's a slightly misleading terminology, because you don't need like a conscious observer to make a measurement. Like it can be any microscopic object. It can be your detector, some sort of device doing the measurement.
I heard Penrose suggested that the particle itself could be the observer.
That would be something else, some other interpretation. All right.
Yeah.
But yeah, the problem is, okay, so basically there is a lot of interpretations of quantum mechanics which are trying to imply some sort of fundamental reality, which
So they're
would
trying to
lead...
explain why it is we see a left sock, but in quantum reality, it's a left and a right sock.
No, it's left, right, and left, right, like all three.
Three different.
Yes,
it's
yes.
three things.
Yes.
But we observe one. Okay.
Yes.
And so this collapse is all about how it is we end up seeing some fixed reality. Is that it?
Yes, and colloquially, it's known as the problem of measurement. Like basically, what happens during measurement? And if we strictly like focus on this part of disappearance of superpositions, it's called wave function collapse, or any other synonyms that you named previously. So, and there are different answers to this problem. Like, for example, you have many worlds interpretation, very popular right now.
Is this
for
the
some reason.
multi-universe?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
I think many people are interested in that one.
Yeah, I know. I personally
There's a lot
think
of television. There's a lot of television programs and stuff, science fiction about this.
I don't like it, but I know that many people do, and it's very popular right now. So their basic premise is that, okay, like during the measurement, basically our whole universe is split in two different universes. In one universe, you've measured the left sock, and in another, it's the right sock, and they kind of continue on parallel courses, so they never interact.
So we've got these three states. We've got this sock that exists as a left, a right, and both the left and the right.
Yes.
And then we pick it up and we go, oh, it's a left sock.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying is that once we made that measurement, then there's a world in which I see a left sock and there's a world in which I see a right sock, and they run in parallel to each other. Okay.
Yeah, they never interact since then. And like philosophically, like it just seems like a bit of an overstretch, Like you're trying to invoke a whole universe to explain one small particle. That's a little bit too much, in my opinion. There's a principle called Occam's razor, You don't invoke entities without necessity, Why do we need a whole universe to explain one particle?
But many people think this is just science fiction, right? They just think it's total gobbledygook science fiction. But there are many, many scientists who take this very seriously. Is that not right?
Yeah, that's true. But then again, as I've said, like scientists have problems with like basic philosophy, like basic logic even. So I'm not surprised, you know. But again, it just illustrates my point that I've made, that scientists are very ignorant in this respect.
Right. They don't know they're straying into this other territory. And I think they're being very rational.
Like
so
again,
what are some of the more simple or more plausible explanations for how it is we perceive a left sock when the sock itself has 3 states?
There is an approach called... there is, by the way, a Copenhagen interpretation, which has been the most popular, actually. Before the many worlds, I think right now many worlds is more popular, but previously Copenhagen was more popular. So what they say is just... Basically, there is a quantum world where these things can happen, like these 3 different states can exist. But there is also macroscopic world or classical world where, you know, objects like you and
the one
I...
we see, right?
Yeah. Like big objects can exist, right?
Okay.
And when a big object kind of interacts with a small object, like this, the quantumness of a quantum object kind of breaks. So this sort of irreparable transition happens, right? And this is exactly the collapse of the wave function.
So it's like when big people observe little particles and we interact with them, then their quantum kind of state just collapses and they become normal.
It's just kind of ruined. But
they have a nervous breakdown and then they suddenly become a left or a right spinning electron. Okay.
Yes, but again, I have to stress it's not necessarily people. It can be just a detector, but it's also a macroscopic device, you know.
Something big, right.
Yeah. But it still leaves out questions like why does this happen, right? What is the fundamental difference between quantum particles and macroscopic objects? Because again, macroscopic objects supposedly, according to physics, are made of quantum particles, right? In the first place. So there's this problem. Then there is another problem, like where exactly do the particles and macroscopic objects begin? You know, where does this transition happen? At which scale, if you wish? You know, it's like this ancient Greek sophism called a pile. Have you heard about it? Yeah. No. Okay, so one piece of sand is not a pile, right? It's not a pile of sand. Yeah, so if you add one more, it's still not a pile, right? So therefore, the sophism says, however much sand you put, it's still not a pile. So piles don't exist, yeah?
So it's funny because these things you're talking about come up in Tibetan Buddhism. This thing about the pile, for example, and the way we analyze reality. They're things that we talk about in standard Tibetan teachings, really. But so when does it become a pile?
So there are other alternative approaches. Like, for example, there is a big thing in quantum theory connected to information, like a big quantum information theory. And according to it, there is a process called decoherence, which is, again, what really decoherence means is just the disappearance of this left-right combination of socks, you know. But how they describe it is that this quantumness of a single particle, when it's sort of collides with a big system, like this information on the superposition, it's never lost. Like in Copenhagen interpretation, it's just erased during the measurement. Right. So you cannot retrieve it. But in like quantum information approaches, they say, well, it is not erased. It doesn't disappear. It just gets sort of like smeared over the big system. You know, like with a very thin layer of butter, sort of, you know. So it is there. You just cannot retrieve it, you know. Just like, again, sort of like the regular process of, I don't want to say this word, but I will, entropy increase, you know? Yeah. Like, the information gets kind of lost. Like, for example, you can write something on a piece of paper. I'm trying to give you an analogy, okay? So you're writing something on a piece of paper, then you burn this piece of paper, and it turns into, you know, CO2 and H2O and whatever. And, like, technically, if you can reverse time, like the information is still there, these pieces can still get back.
Become a piece of paper again.
Become piece of paper and you can read it. But there is no practical way of achieving this. Like you'll never get this information back, what was written. And that's kind of what they say with respect to quantum information. Like it's there, you just can't get it.
Retrieve it.
Yes.
This is another interesting question, because when we look at our kind of scientific equations, mathematical equations, we have great faith in them, and they can make super, 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 super accurate predictions about stuff. They're just unimaginably accurate. So we can have nuclear bombs and all that sort of stuff. But in that equation, there's no real reason why we can't reverse any of the, like we can bring down the weight, we can increase the energy, and there's no real reason why we shouldn't be able to, for example, reverse time. But we know that doesn't happen, right? So there must be some issue there, right? We have this equation, we can increase energy and put it into the equation, we can reduce the mass, but why can't we bring the time forward and backwards?
That's a big question, yes.
Doesn't it indicate that maybe this measurement of time that we have is slightly mistaken, or the way we think about it?
Yeah, I would say so. Like, currently, actually, I'm not sure, but I think that most of the physicists actually connect exactly this parameter entropy, i.e. the degree. Like, many people misunderstand entropy. It's really the measure of how focused your energy is. So the more entropy, the more distributed the energy is. So if you have a lump
how focused your energy is.
No,
because most people talk about it in terms of order, right?
Yeah, the more entropy, the less focused, basically.
Okay.
The more distributed. Right. So if you have a lump of energy in one spot and no energy anywhere else, that's low entropy system. If you have energy equally distributed everywhere, it's maximum entropy. All right.
Right. That's kind of opposite of the way people think about entropy. Because really, if you have diffuse energy, it's very ordered, right?
Yeah, but that's maximum entropy, actually. Right. So that's why, for example, if you have a hot body and a cold body, like it's low entropy, and for entropy to increase, the heat has to be evenly distributed.
Which is the tendency, isn't it? Law of thermodynamics.
But basically most of the physicists, as far as I'm aware, they connect time to exactly that, the rising entropy, essentially. Yeah. But there's a whole big issue about living beings. Like, why do living beings decrease their entropy? Basically, we are focusing energy, we are eating and we are growing. And we are becoming more structured, more focused.
But over time we age as well, don't we?
That also happens. Yeah. I mean, strictly speaking, just so that there wouldn't be any angry comments, I'm not saying that living beings contradict second law of thermodynamics. They don't decrease their entropy for free. We decrease our entropy by exporting entropy, with our waste products, basically.
Right.
So
we manage our entropy.
Yes. Because human beings and living beings in general are open systems. They exchange energy, information, and mass with the environment. All right.
Now, there's a question I wanted to ask you. You might help shed some light on this. And that's this idea of asynchronous time, or and also this sort of symmetry, asymmetrical time. For example, we have this really strong notion that there was a beginning of the universe, and then it will go on into the future, don't we? Most people are looking at, especially scientists, they're thinking about, where did the universe begin? This is a huge question, and I think it's something that is addressed by philosophy, religion, metaphysics, physics. Everybody questions this, right? Now, the Buddha obviously said things are secular, that there is no beginning. But in general, we think there was a starting point. If that's the case, that means that, time is asymmetrical. It has a definite beginning, and then it just goes off into the future infinitely, this sort of thing. And it also necessitates a creation myth or some means by which the universe can come into existence. So can you just talk a little bit about your understanding of this process?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I have to say that, yes, it is the currently accepted, theory by majority of physicists or supposedly at least, the Big Bang hypothesis, I mean, that the universe began in the first place, right? Because there are physicists who are against the Big Bang, and there's a lot of them, actually. There was a big letter of physicists against the Big Bang. It was sometime in the early 2000s, I think. But like as time goes on, like less and less critics remain, actually. Like literally remain alive. Like that there's less and less people not subjected to this sort of...
You make it sound like they've been eliminated. Well, I mean, they're just getting old and dying, right?
Yes. But you know what Max Planck said? Basically the guy who invented quanta, he said that the science progresses one funeral at a time. You know. So basically, whatever the old generation of scientists,
it's religion
dies,
as well. Buddhism is the same.
Yeah, but in this case, it's the reverse. Like the critics are also dying, unfortunately. But I don't agree with the Big Bang hypothesis, mostly because, again, like in my eyes, what physics is about, at least the physics I've been trained in, is conservation laws. Like when we use equations, we're always relying on some sort of conservation. You know, you have a system which is described by parameter. Let's call, for example, energy. There is a certain amount of energy in the system right now. And you say, okay, if the energy is conserved, then whatever happens to the system, I can equate the previous energy to the new energy and then maybe calculate something. All right. Like, for example, if I know a height from which a brick falls and I know the mass of a brick and the force of gravity, I can calculate what kind of velocity this brick would have, because I know that the potential energy of the brick is translated into kinetic energy of the brick. That's kind of the kind of thing that physics usually does. Then we have conservation of, again, energy. We have conservation of momentum, angular momentum, etc., etc., etc. Electric charge, for example. But if the universe began, then there is no conservation because there was nothing and then there's everything, right? So it's unphysical, kind of. And it's a big problem.
Fundamental paradox on the spiritual path is because you have something from nothing.
Yeah, so you either believe causality, i.e. conservation laws, or you have to get rid of, you either believe causality or you believe Big Bang, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't see a problem in religious point of view, for example. They didn't have nothing. They've had God, right? There was already something. And then God created the universe. But the God is almighty, like he doesn't care, you know. He can create whatever he wants.
But this creates another paradox in the Buddha Dharma. Because we refute the idea that something can come from nothing. But also the idea that there's something pre-existent, permanent, and a causeless agent is a huge problem. Because then that entity... If you ask, well, God created the universe, then you have to ask, like, did God create the universe from herself or from something else? Again, it's about conservation, right? And if this God is like permanent, has always been there, then how can it be a changing entity, and how can it be it's basically causeless, right? It also refutes the idea of conservation. So that's a big issue.
Yeah, true. But I also want to talk a little bit, not a whole lot, but I just want to throw in some names here. So when you've asked about asymmetric time, indeed, both in classical mechanics and in quantum mechanics, time is basically just a parameter. So you can move forwards and backwards and nothing would change. Like all the equations look the same. So you can basically, you know, rewind the tape of the world backwards and everything would look fine, you know. Like
which is how we came to the Big Bang, right? We did this reverse extrapolation in going back.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That's one thing. So the laws of mechanics, both classical and quantum, are formulated with time being just a parameter. Like basically we have a trajectory and time describes where we are at this trajectory, but we can move back and forth whatever we like, whichever we like. But there are some alternative theories where time is indeed asymmetrical, like axiomatically, like by definition. We just introduce time as a parameter which has a directionality to it. For example, there is fairly unknown, I would say. Kozyrev, like Nikolai Kozyrev, was a Soviet astronomer, actually. So he developed this theory with time having a direction, because he says, well, he basically postulates that clearly future is different from the past, and therefore, like, there is some, let's say, some interval between the cause and the effect. And that's why he calls his theory causal mechanics, because it distinguishes causes and effects. And he actually arrives at very interesting conclusions, but I'm not going to talk about them. I'll just say that there are theories, but they're all like, borderline fringe theories, where time
Not
actually is
generally
directional. Accepted. Yes, absolutely not accepted. Yeah.
Really, I think in Hindu tradition and in Buddhism, time is more considered as being central, right? It's about being central to time rather than it having a direction or being symmetrical. So there is basically the present moment of experience. And everything else is provisional or relative to that. So within that system, then you can have different possible outcomes, but also different possible other iterations of existence. And this kind of ties in nicely with quantum physics, because the idea basically is that everything is in this superposition. Everything is like a potential of outcomes and is never fixed. And the mistake we make, in terms of Buddhism, for example, is we say that there is a classical reality, right? This is the basis on which we say that this quantum reality has to collapse into something we measure. And we believe that because we've made a measurement. So we measure some phenomena and we say, oh, it has this state. And that is what's refuted in the Buddha Dharma, that things don't possess fixed identity. They're just, it's like, when we talk about Schrödinger's cat, right? There's this cat who's alive, dead, and both dead and alive. And then we open the box, oh, there's a dead cat. And in Buddhism we say, well, that dead cat isn't the previous cat. They're different, right? So there isn't a need for it to collapse. It's just another observation. Like, in fact, the way we see ourselves to be. When I was young, I was a child, I remember that, and I'm part of that continuum now. But in Buddhism, what we're saying is that, well, this person you think you are now is not that person. It's not even related.
But how do you then describe causality? Because can you explain
causality is provisional. This is interesting, because we say that karma is infallible. So if you make an action, then there will be results. But causality itself is not an ultimate thing. It's a provisional thing. So if karma was ultimate, then that means we could have things like a predictable universe, a predetermined universe, right? But the other thing is you couldn't change outcomes. So if I had negative karma and it was a ultimate thing, like a permanent, unchanging thing, then there's no way I could be liberated, because it would always produce negative outcomes. There would be no way of getting rid of it. So what is taught, especially by Nagarjuna, is that the reason why we experience things or we can perceive things is because they evolve out of causes and effects, like a chain of causes and effects. And because of that, we can interact and perceive observable phenomena. But because that they are formed from this, this network, as you were describing, of different relationships, then they are empty of nature. And it's not only that, like, for example, me at this moment is empty of any specific nature, but also all the causes and conditions that lead to that appearance themselves are also subject to this kind of ultimate truth of emptiness. They themselves are also kind of like a fragile interrelation of superpositions. And so nothing has fixed identity. It appears, but it doesn't have any kind of substantial existence. But in general, I think the way that Buddhism describes things is different, right?
I still don't get it. How can you have karma without fundamental causality or determination, or at least some laws?
Well, but determination, if things were really predetermined, or if there was determination, then, for example, karma would have to be something permanent. If you're going to say, well, whatever happens in the future, this will be the outcome, then there would have to be this fixed, it's the wrong way of thinking about causality, but there's this fixed arrow of time, and things will be subject to that. But what Nagarjuna is saying is that there's infinite interdependent relationships, and because of that, things appear as this kind of potentiality or superposition. Do you see?
Mm-hmm.
So it supports the idea that things never have a fixed identity. And if we look at, let's say, if we look at time itself, like if we say time is a quanta, right? They're discrete moments of time. Then you can ask the question, well, are these quanta of time synchronous? For example, is there one discrete moment and then another? And for me and for somebody on Alpha Centauri, those are in sync with each other. We would generally wouldn't accept that, right? That's what Einstein had proven, that there wasn't this synchronous time. Which means that these discrete moments of time have no direct interrelationship. Fixed interrelationship.
One thing that people frequently mention with respect to this is that this idea of the arrow of time, it's a very Christian idea, right? You have the birth of Christ and the motion towards the judgment, you know. And that's where the idea comes from, essentially. And that would
the arrows
probably
of time in Buddhism look like turbulence. In a washing machine. They're like going.
So I guess that.
But anyway, I mean, there's so much I could talk to you about. There's so many questions I could ask. And anybody who's made it this far into the podcast, then congratulations to you. I think some of it's probably beyond the scope of our basic education and understanding. And been really happy to have you here on the channel. I just wanted to ask you a little bit, something more personal, really. Because as I understand that you live in Belarus, which, you know, is kind of a country that most people in the West have a very vague idea of what it's like to live in. And you said to me previously that you wouldn't really want to move anywhere else. I know they have got a lot of political problems there. You've got an election coming up. There's been a lot of suppression. There's no democracy there, basically. So can you just tell us a little bit about what it's like being a kind of intellectual in Belarus in the 21st century?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's very depressing, not gonna lie. Like the country is not very welcome for free thinkers. But if you don't really speak up anything about local politics, you're mostly fine, I would say.
Yeah.
But like for me, again, like I'm not a very optimistic person in the first place, you know. So this sort of climate is actually kind of fine for me. Like, you know, a little bit of suffering, especially in my youth. Like it was very inspiring creatively, you know. I mean, like, it might sound horrible, but it is what it is. Like. Like generally the country is very like I would say the people are very educated actually, and they're very disciplined. Everything is very clean. Everything is kind of like the public transportation is perfect. Like everything is fine. All the services are working. We are just poor. That's it. But you know, we have enough money to eat. We have enough money to buy some clothes, and maybe it's a little bit extra, but not more than that. You know. But like imagine, I don't know, maybe some place like Ireland, maybe. But if Ireland was run by a mob of gangsters or something, so there would be like no democracy, and if you have some business and you have a bit of money, you get extorted by the government, essentially. Something like that. That would be Belarus.
Canadians often complain about the government, being ripped off by the government. I wonder what they would feel like if they went to live in Belarus or somewhere like that, or Russia or something, you know. It's quite difficult.
But
and also I understand you're a musician, is that right?
Yeah, true. Yeah, I play guitar, I play bass guitar, yeah.
Do you have a band in Belarus or anything like that?
Well, I used to. Right now I'm not really playing anywhere. Like I don't really, like I'm a bit too old, you know, to play in a rock show at some bar. Like when I was 20, it was fine. When I'm 35, that's not quite the thing.
Well, 35 is not that old. You know, these days, though, most of the bands are all granddads. It's like granddad rock. If you go to any bar or anything in the West, then half of the bands are all in their 50s and things like that.
Yeah, well, every now and then I participate in, you know, like jam sessions, but not very often. like maybe like a few times a year, really.
And what inspired you to kind of learn music or play music initially? Was it related to your kind of philosophical outlook?
No, it actually started earlier. Like I started, writing poetry, writing music when I was like 14 and learning to play guitar. And philosophy, that was a bit later, like when I was 16 or 17. So it was just a general part of my my curiosity about the world, my desire to express myself in some way, just the regular stuff of the youth.
Belarusian rock bands sound like. You'll have to send me some some links. It'd be very interesting to see what kind of music they play in Belarus.
All right.
Probably have some interesting punk bands and things like that.
Yeah.
And you said that you kind of more recently have developed an interest in the spiritual path. Is that right? When did that happen?
Let's say a year and a half ago, something like that. But it wasn't like a sudden event. It just kind of crawled in.
How did you find our channel?
I
I noticed you made some comments on our YouTube channel.
Yeah, it was this famous video of yours about the shit posting for Buddha.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah, I just got recommended it. It was hilarious enough, the title, for me to click. And I haven't seen anyone in the monk's robes on the YouTube at all. So I like, okay, let's try. Let's see what this guy has to say.
It's the modern thing, right? Isn't it? You just put something kind of controversial, and suddenly you get loads of.
It wasn't even controversial. It was more like interesting. Like I was curious,
right.
I wasn't outraged or whatever. Like it was just an interesting combination. Let's put it this way.
Yeah, I try not to produce clickbait for the sake of producing clickbait, but you do have to get people's attention. So that's actually quite recent that you've developed an interest in the spiritual path.
Yes.
I know that in some of your videos you've talked about God. Do you kind of believe in God, or what does God mean to you?
All right. So as much as I don't believe in particles, I also don't believe in God. So, or you can turn it the reverse, as much as I do believe in particles, I do believe in God, okay? So basically, as much as we can construct an entity called an electron, we can also construct an entity called God, even though there is a very distinct differences, like there are big differences between those objects. For example, like again, electron is a part of what we may call physical world, whereas I do think that whatever we may call God or gods, don't have any physical connotation, physical body, essentially. So they are also objects which can also do stuff, actually, but only through agency of others, like people specifically. And I think gods are concepts of the same level as, for example, things like law or economy or country, for example. Like, for example, law, it doesn't have a physical body. But to say that law doesn't exist would be an overstretch, I would say. It does. It exists in people's heads, and people manifest it through their actions. And in the same way, gods do exist. Like, you can genuinely manifest really any god you want if you believe in this god. Whatever the god you're believing in. And you can manifest
do you believe in a division between this kind of mind and physical world?
At the moment, I do find these things useful. This is a division that appeared in modernity, so that would be like the 17th century, in Europe at least. And maybe in other places it was some other time.
Well, the Buddha taught about a division between consciousness and matter 2,600 years ago. So I am currently, I think this division is useful, but I do think at the same time that science is over focusing on only the physical, right? So basically they're missing half of reality. That's kind of my problem with it, right? They're just dismissing they just basically believe it's like an emergent property of the brain. It's like physical action on the brain creates consciousness, which is
and I'm more like, if I understood you correctly, maybe I didn't, but if I understood you correctly, I'm more on a sort of a quasi-Buddhist position where we say that this thing is, provisional, as you call it, and probably both body and the soul are provisional. They're just imaginary objects. But as much as we believe in one, we kind of have to believe in the other, and vice versa. As much as we don't believe in one, we have to don't believe in the other. But they are useful. Both of them are useful. And there is a European philosophy, like European occultism, which I'm also very interested in, specifically one instance of it, which is called Hermeticism or Hermetism. And what is Hermetism is about? It's exactly that. There is a visible world, what we call, physical world, and there is an invisible world, what we call the world of ideas or the world of gods or the spiritual world, right? But what is Hermes or Hermeticism? It's like Hermes is a messenger between people, the physical world, and gods, the spiritual world. So Hermeticism is about building a bridge between those two worlds. Like, when alchemists were making a philosopher's stone, what is it? It's essentially a physical object which contains a spiritual object inside of it. It's the basically you're putting a soul of a god into a stone, something like this. You're making a synthesis of both worlds, something like this. So I'm very interested in this sort of thing. But again, with my background as a physicist, I'm kind of trying to formulate it as simple and mechanistic as possible. And
using Occam's razor again.
Yeah. I'm only starting here, so I don't have any sort of special religion or philosophy that I want to teach to people. I'm only learning myself, so
that's it. We need to learn, right? We need to keep an open mind and think
absolutely,
for ourselves.
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. And on that note, now our 1 hour is finished, and I just want to thank everybody for joining us, and thank you, Eugene. It's been a really interesting conversation. And I think maybe in future we could continue on. I've got lots more questions to ask you about philosophy and physics. Perhaps many questions to ask about Nietzsche and exactly what the hell he was talking about.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for watching, and thank you, Choga, for having me.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Bye now.
Goodbye.